Hello students, welcome to the second video of photosynthesis. Let's have a look in this video to the light reactions of photosynthesis. Before starting, I will summarize a little bit what we have seen in the previous video. In the previous video we have talked about what photosynthesis actually is, that is done by plants and algae all over the world. And it's a process that converts sunlight, water and carbon dioxide into oxygen and glucose. So before starting with the light reactions, we have to know what ATP is. ATP is a molecule that is part from the nucleotide biomolecules group. And it's a very important molecule. The name is adenosine triphosphate. It's a molecule that is in fact the energy molecule for all our cells. So it's a molecule that is able to store energy, and we have three types of it. We have adenosine monophosphate, which has only one phosphate group. We have adenosine diphosphate, which has two phosphate groups, and adenosine triphosphate, which has three phosphate groups. The energy level of the molecule is higher the more phosphates it has. So ATP has more energy than ADP, and ADP has more energy than AMP. So what cells use for energy is ATP, and it's also ATP that is produced in photosynthesis. So that's what you have to remember. ATP is the energy molecule for all our cells. Photosynthesis makes energy, ATP molecules, and that energy is needed for all other cells of any other organism. There is another molecule which is called NADPH, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. This is an energy carrying molecule, so you can see it as a kind of battery you can charge, because what the molecule basically does is, imagine you have a molecule that has a double bond, like here, this CO double bond. Double bonds have more energy than single bonds. So when a double bond becomes a single bond, here, there is energy liberated. This energy, when it's liberated, it's absorbed by the capturing of electrons that are liberated by the molecule NADPH. So what you have to remember is that NADPH is a molecule that can absorb electrons, more or less, and by that it charges energy from breaking down molecules, double bonds to single bonds. Okay, you don't have to know a lot more about it, because it's more chemistry than biology at this point for this course. So just remember that it's a molecule that can store energy when molecules are reduced. Let's have a look at this slide. This slide explains what light reactions are. So in fact, in this video, we're only looking at the light reactions, which is half of the story. Here you can see the light reactions. What happens in the light reactions is here sunlight, water is used to produce ATP. Remember, that's the energy molecule, and NADPH, which is cofactor, another molecule that can store energy. So that's what happens in the light reactions. We use sunlight, water to produce O2 and these energy molecules. So how does that work? We have sunlight coming into the photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 is a system of proteins. Some proteins, the name are chlorophyll A, what you can find in the chloroplasts. Those molecules, those pigment molecules, they are able to absorb sunlight. You can see those pigment molecules here. When they absorb sunlight, they become agitated. When they become agitated or excited because of the sunlight, they are able to withdraw electrons from water. Here you have the water molecule. They withdraw electrons from water. So they absorb, thanks to the energy of the sunlight, they absorb electrons from water, which has as a result that water is split into two pieces, two hydrogen molecules and half an O2 molecule, or one oxygen molecule. So it absorbs the electrons from water, and it does not only absorb them, it brings them to an agitated state, which means that the electrons become high energy. Okay, they become higher energy, like you can see here on the line. The energy of the molecules becomes higher, the energy of the electrons, sorry. So, in the thylakoid membrane, there is a primary electron receptor which receives these high energy electrons and let them cascade down in the second phase to a lower energy. When these electrons go from high to low energy, of course, they lose energy. This energy is used to make ATP. In the next slide, we will tell you how that exactly works. When the electrons arrive to lower energy, they arrive to a second photosystem, which we call photosystem 1. Also, this photosystem is made of chlorophyll A proteins, and they're able again to absorb sunlight. When they absorb sunlight, they bring the electrons from a low energy again to a high energy state here. They are received by another electron receptor, and the same process is repeated. The electrons go from high energy, they cascade down to lower energy, but in the second, in the electron transport chain 1, which is the second electron transport chain, the electrons are used to produce the high energy molecule NADPH. So it captures the electrons to become to a higher energy level. Before we go to the next slide, it's important to mention what in fact the name of the process is that produces ATP. We call this chemiosmosis. Okay, chemiosmosis is the energy of electron movement through the thylakoid membrane that creates a proton gradient. Proton gradient, it's H plus gradient that drives the ATP synthase to produce ATP. So that's the process that we're going to see in the next slide, which is an analogy that explains a little bit how that ATP is produced. It's also important to notice that ATP is produced by joining one ADP, I'm writing it here down, one ADP together with one phosphate produces ATP, because ADP is adenosine diphosphate. So with one more phosphate, it becomes ATP. So in fact, the energy production is just the connection of a phosphate group to ADP in order to form ATP. And like previously mentioned, it's ATP that is the gasoline or the energy for all the cells. So it's very important to produce that. This is my all-time favorite slide, because this slide really gives us a very nice overview of how the light reaction happens. So let's start all over again to bring it all together. So we are in the mesophyll cells in a certain leaf on a certain tree. In those mesophyll cells, we find chloroplasts, which you can see here. This is a chloroplast. Each of those chloroplasts has thylakoid discs, which you can see here, the thylakoid discs. Okay. What happens in every thylakoid disc is the light reaction, and it's in the membrane, what you can see here, in the membrane of the thylakoid disc, that the reaction, the light reaction is happening. So let's have a look at that. We have here the thylakoid membrane, the double phospholipid layer. Here we have photosystem 2. Like I said before, it's a photosystem. Photosystem 2 is made of proteins, which are called chlorophyll A. Those proteins, which we can find here in the membrane, they're able to capture light energy or sunlight. When they capture sunlight, they are able to take away electrons from water, and when they take them away from water, water is split into two hydrogen molecules and an oxygen molecule. They don't only absorb the sunlight, they also take the electrons away, and they bring them to a higher energy level here in this electron receptor. When they arrive here, the electrons are transferred to electron transport chain 2, which is another protein complex. The electrons are transferred, and when they travel through the electron transport chain 2, they go from high energy to low energy. So the electrons, they lose energy. And the energy, of course, is not lost. The energy is used to pump H plus atoms, protons we call them, in from outside the membrane inside the thylakoid space. So this causes that we have a high concentration of protons or H plus atoms in the inside of the thylakoid space. This concentration of H plus protons travel through a protein which is called ATP synthase, and the name says it itself. The ATP synthase is able to produce ATP. I go in the next slide, I explain exactly how that happens, but basically the H plus protons, they travel through the protein, and by traveling through the protein, ATP is produced, as you can see here. Okay? Let's go back to the proteins that were at the low energy now. They enter a second photosystem, which we call photosystem 1. When they enter photosystem 1, they are again lifted from low energy to high energy. How do they do that? Because the chlorophyll molecules, they absorb sunlight and they bring the electrons to a high energy state. When the electron transporter, the electron acceptor, receives the electrons, it transports it to another electron transport chain, which you can see here, the electron transport chain 1, and it brings the electrons again through a cascade system from high energy to low energy. And in this case, in this electron transport chain cascade, there is not ATP produced, but we're producing NADPH. So the energy from the electrons is transferred to NADPH, which will enter in the Calvic cycle, which is in fact the light-independent reaction, which we'll see in the third video. This is an interesting analogy because it explains us how ATP is made. We can compare it like a turbine. So the turbine is in the thylakoid membrane, the ATP synthase, which I will write here, the ATP synthase. So it's in fact the fabric which is producing the ATP. Sorry for my writing, but it's gonna say ATP synthase. So it's the protein that is producing ATP. So the rotor is spinning, and then it's producing ATP. Okay, ATP comes out. But what makes the rotor spinning? ATP. This is to be ATP. What makes the rotor spin? It's not water, but it's the H plus protons that were pumped into the thylakoid membrane in the electron transport chain 2, which you can see on the other slide. So H plus protons, they travel through the ATP synthase, and when they travel through it, they make the ATP synthase spin and they produce ATP. I'm going to conclude with this slide, and in the end of this video you can see an animation of the light reactions, a video animation, which I invite you to look at to have a deeper understanding of the process.
Plants provide us with food to eat and oxygen to breathe. They perform this amazing feat by the process of photosynthesis. Let's take a closer look. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, which diffuses into the leaf through small pores and then enters the cells. Inside the cell, carbon dioxide diffuses into the chloroplasts, where photosynthesis takes place. Chloroplasts use energy from light to transform carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. Zooming into a chloroplast, we see these flattened membranous sacs called thylakoids. Here, light energy is converted to chemical energy in the first phase of photosynthesis, the light reactions. The two green structures you see here are photosystems, large complexes of proteins and chlorophyll that capture light energy. An electron transport chain connects the two photosystems. Notice the small mobile electron carriers that shuttle electrons from one large complex to another. Now let's take a closer look at the steps of the light reactions. The photosystem on the left absorbs light energy, exciting electrons that enter the electron transport chain. Electrons are replaced with electrons stripped from water, creating oxygen as a byproduct. The energized electrons flow down the electron transport chain, releasing energy that is used to pump hydrogen ions, the blue balls, into the thylakoid. In the photosystem on the right, light energy excites electrons, and this time the electrons are captured by an electron carrier molecule, NADPH. The high concentration of hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid powers ATP synthase, producing ATPs. The light reactions in the thylakoid have produced two energy products, ATP and NADPH, that will now power the production of sugar in the Calvin cycle.